An 8-year-long conflict in eastern Ukraine that started in 2014 escalated into a full-scale war when Vladimir Putin started his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. More than 6 months have passed since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Most expected the war to be over in several weeks, for Russia to prevail and Ukraine to fall apart quickly amidst the indecisiveness of the West. But Ukrainian resistance, unexpected weakness of the perceived second strongest army in the world, and a strong Western response have created a completely different situation. In this video, we're going to summarize and analyze the Russo-Ukrainian war since its start, and discuss potential developments in the foreseeable future. Please note that the script for this video was written on the 10th of September 2022. After months of uncertainty, amidst warnings from the United States and the United Kingdom about an impending Russian invasion of Ukraine, on February 24th, Russia attacked Ukraine from 4 main axes, with an estimated 150,000-strong force. Against the capital Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy from Belarus in the north, on Kharkiv from the northeast, on the Ukraine-controlled Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast from the southeast, and against Kherson and Melitopol from Crimea in the south. Russia's official pretext for this invasion, which they called the Special Military Operation, was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Russia also claimed that Ukraine has biolabs creating bioweapons, but failed to prove it. Another justification was the possible Ukrainian acceptance into NATO, but the alliance doesn't allow countries with territorial disputes to join it. On top of that, we have recently learned that in the first few days of the invasion, Ukraine offered Russia to give guarantees of its neutral status, but Putin rejected that, showing that NATO accession was just a pretext. The Kremlin's strategy was based upon an assumption that the Ukrainian government and the military would crumble very quickly. According to the Washington Post investigation, Putin was misled by his intelligence, which argued that the Ukrainian government was unpopular and that the Ukrainians were going to meet the Russians as liberators. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Despite the decent initial advance of the Russian army, the main prize, Kyiv, stood tall. Buoyed by defiant Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian society refused to give up its country's independence. The Ukrainian army was also much stronger in comparison with 2014. Strengthened with anti-tank javelins and NLAWs, it managed to inflict painful losses to the Russian armored force, while withdrawing towards cities in an orderly manner and harassing Russian supply lines. Russian airborne attacks on Kyiv and Kharkiv failed. A 65-kilometer-long mass-armored column of the Russian army advancing on Kyiv did not change the tide in the Battle of Kyiv either. The biggest success of the Russian army in the early phase of the war was the capture of Kherson, the only large regional center taken by the Russian army throughout the theater in early March. The Ukrainian government has implicitly taken responsibility for this setback. But why did Russia fail to defeat Ukraine within weeks? Why did Kyiv not fall within 3 to 4 days, as the US government expected? Investigations and analyses of the Russian invasion of Ukraine seem to conclude that Russia did not expect much resistance in Ukraine. The Russian command believed that Kyiv would fall quickly, which would cause a chain reaction all over Ukraine. The fall of the Ukrainian government would break the spirit of the Ukrainian army to fight, and Russia would freely advance, as it did at the start of the conflict in 2014. So when Ukraine offered a spirited resistance, Russia was simply not ready for this. Poor coordination between different military units and branches, inability to conduct major offensive operations, low morale of Russian soldiers, inability to ensure stable supply of the forces at the front line, and a failure to establish air superiority doomed Russia into a long, protracted and bloody campaign in Ukraine. Why did Russia fail to have dominance in the air, despite its 1,511-98 advantage in combat aircraft at the start? For instance, Harry Boneham of Global Data argued that it was linked with the poor training of Russian pilots, lack of precision-guided munition, which forced Russian aircraft to fly at low altitudes and expose themselves to the Ukrainian air defenses, including the Western-provided manpads, Western intelligence support to the Ukrainian army, and unwillingness of the Russian command to risk its costly aircraft against the background of these factors. Early lack of success and unsustainable casualties, especially in terms of armor, forced the Russian command to rethink its strategy and withdraw from the Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts in April 2022, and to focus on its offensive in Donbass. Russia simply did not have enough men to continue fighting on all four axes. The size of their invading force was planned in accordance with the scenario of a rapid Ukrainian collapse, and when this scenario failed, the Russian command decided to narrow its objective. But military setbacks were not the only blow Russia received at the beginning of the war. Despite initial hesitations, Western countries have imposed painful sanctions on Russia. The most consequential sanctions include freezing almost half of Russia's financial reserves, disconnecting major Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system, banning Russian ships and planes from entering Western ports and airspace, restriction in the export of advanced technology to Russia, and import of Russian goods, including energy imports from Russia. Along with that, more than 1,200 foreign companies have left Russia and suspended or restricted their operations there, including Apple, Visa, MasterCard, and so on. As a result, Russian GDP had fallen by 4% in the second quarter of 2022, and according to the IMF projection, Russia will lose at least 6% of its GDP by the end of the year. The Russian economy is suffering from high inflation. Production in many sectors has dwindled, as Russia couldn't import most of the goods it needed to feed its industry. According to Al Jazeera, Russia's car production plummeted by a stunning 61.8% during the first 6 months of this year. But the Russian economy has proved to be less vulnerable to sanctions than it was forecasted, due to an initial rise in energy prices. However, as Russia basically stopped selling oil and gas to Europe, and India and China, who managed to fill their stores, are not buying the oil and gas at the same rate, this process largely stopped, and in August, Russian energy revenues dropped to $11 billion, lowest in 14 months. The Kremlin has also increased government spending, which helped keep the economy afloat. The government managed to keep the ruble relatively stable through different monetary measures, along with keeping inflation under control, as its rate was at 14.9% in August, a 3% decrease from its peak in April. While the Russian economy has definitely suffered and decreased due to Western sanctions, the reports on its death are rather premature. Economists and analysts expect the impact of sanctions to be felt gradually in Russia, and in the foreseeable future. But for now, the Russian economy is surviving. Sanctions have had a negative impact on the quality of life of ordinary Russians. It's difficult to know the exact number at this point, but hundreds of thousands of Russians have left the country following the invasion. In the tech sector alone, an estimated 50 to 70,000 Russians have emigrated. Many Russians whose work is deeply connected to the global economy have had no other choice but to leave. Many others who opposed the invasion have done the same, possibly fearing repercussions for their position. At this point, Russia is experiencing a brain drain, the impact of which we will see in the future. How supportive are Russians of their government's decision to invade Ukraine? Right after the start of the invasion, thousands of Russians took to the streets to protest Putin's decision. But in the absence of an organized opposition following the arrest of Alexei Navalny and repressions against his anti-corruption foundation that occurred earlier, the Russian law enforcement managed to curb these protests rather easily. After a while, mass protests turned into solitary protests and calls by prominent Russians to stop the war, acts which often resulted in fines, administrative arrests, and all sorts of problems with law enforcement. Usual suspects were Russian intelligentsia, writers, journalists, film directors, actors, and so on. but in a somewhat unexpected turn of events, several Russian oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska, Mikhail Fridman, and Oleg Tinkov also called to stop the invasion,